Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Nancy Shahadi. I'm the program coordinator for the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for our program on navigating the news in the 2024 election. Before we begin, I just have a few announcements. If you could just make sure your cell phones are on silent before we begin. Those students that are receiving extra credit for attending tonight's program, just make sure that you're signing in and scanning the QR code to your right on the registration table here. There'll be a question and answer section. We just ask that if you would like to ask a question, that you make your way to the aisle microphone. Make sure you state your first and last name and Rutgers affiliation, if any. Lastly, I just want to thank all our sponsors for making tonight possible. Your support was greatly appreciated. You can find out more about our sponsors on the pamphlet that you have on your chair and also on our website. Finally, please join me in welcoming the director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, Dr. Elizabeth Maddow.
Thank you, Nancy. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful, little chilly, but a beautiful fall evening. So happy to have everyone. And on behalf of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, I'm honored to welcome you this year to the Arthur J. Holland Lecture, Navigating the News in the 2024 Election, a conversation on media in an era of misinformation, with NPR's Michel Martin and the CEO of the American Sunlight Project, Nina Jankowicz. Very happy to have everyone here. As we all know, in a system of self-government such as the United States, having access to sound, reliable information is critical in order to be able to make sound, well-informed political decisions. So certainly a conversation such as this, as we're heading into the election and the weeks after, will be critically important. Nearly 70 years ago, the Eagleton Institute was founded with a vision of encouraging responsible leadership in civics and governmental affairs, with an aim towards trying to solve public problems. And to be sure, Arthur J. Holland beautifully exemplified this vision. The Arthur J. Holland Program on Ethics in Government honors this distinguished alum of Rutgers University and longtime mayor of Trenton. Arthur Holland was an alum of Rutgers. He attended the graduate school in New Brunswick, but served as the mayor of Trenton actually from 1959 to 1989. I think there was a 4-year gap, but that was a long era of service in Trenton. And his service was marked by an emphasis on transparency and honesty, insisting, quote, that good government was good politics. So since 2008, the Eagleton Institute has honored his legacy with the Arthur J. Holland Program on Ethics in Government. And I want to express my deepest gratitude to the Holland family for their steadfast support of our work and this program. I especially want to give out a mention, his wife, Mayor Holland's wife, Betty, was also a Rutgers alum, but she was also, even more interestingly, an Eagleton graduate fellow, graduating from the class of 1958. So that's remarkable, and we're excited, we're very grateful to the Holland family. So I'd take a moment just to ask if you would please acknowledge the Holland family and the many sponsors who've made tonight possible. Thank you. So at Eagleton, our work is really centered around civic learning and democratic engagement, and in ways that are creative, collaborative, expansive. We're always trying to meet the needs not just of our democracy, but of our students. So I'm thrilled to actually introduce one of our outstanding students, Logan Pineda, who will formally introduce our distinguished guests. Logan is a senior, majoring in political science and criminal justice. He's a minor in Spanish. I first met Logan, I think, sophomore year, was a student in my class, and then once he got into Eagleton, we never let him go. And has stayed with us. It's been a thrill to watch him grow as a student, as a campus leader. Logan serves as the vice president for the Latina X Pre-Law Society, while being very active at Eagleton and is an active member of our undergraduate associates program. Most recently, Logan took on the job of editor-in-chief of the Eagleton Political Journal, which is a nonpartisan, academic-based student journal dedicated really to transforming political thought into meaningful, practical action. So in so many ways, Logan embodies not only the ethos of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, but also the Holland Program. So I'm thrilled to welcome him to the stage to introduce our guest. Logan.
It's a little difficult to speak after Dr. Matter does, but I'll try my best. Good evening, everyone. The author Oscar Wilde wrote, "In America, the president reigns for 4 years, and journalism governs forever and ever." As editor-in-chief of the Eagleton Political Journal this year, I find these words as daunting as they are powerful. The Eagleton Political Journal gives undergraduates the opportunity to produce nonpartisan scholarly work that transforms political thought into meaningful research and writing. It is no surprise that many of our students of the journal are focusing their efforts on the 2024 presidential election. Given that misinformation, disinformation, cheapfakes, and other false narratives easily infect digital content, my generation of writers needs role models who uphold the highest standards of journalistic integrity and ethics. This is why it is such an honor for me to welcome two champions of truth who dedicate their efforts towards navigating those spaces. Michel Martin is the host of the morning edition. Previously, she hosted the weekend edition of All Things Considered, the Consider This Saturday podcast, and Michel Martin Going There. Martin came to NPR in 2006 and launched Tell Me More, a 1-hour daily news and talk show that aired on NPR stations nationwide from 2007 to 2014. The show engaged viewers with important conversations taking place in the halls of government and power, but also in the houses of worship, barbershops, beauty shops, and other spaces. Whatever Michel Martin is working on, she draws upon her deep reporting and interviewing experience to dig into the issues that really matter. Ms. Martin is joined by Nina Jankowicz, co-founder and chief executive officer of the American Sunlight Project. Ms. Jankowicz is an internationally recognized expert on disinformation and democratization, one of Times Magazine's 100 most influential people in AI, and the author of How to Lose the Information War, which the New Yorker called a persuasive new book on disinformation as a geopolitical strategy. Jankowicz has advised governments, international organizations, and tech companies, and has testified before the US Congress, the British Parliament, and the European Parliament. We are incredibly fortunate to have these two trailblazers with us tonight to help us navigate the complexities in an age navigate the complexities of truth in an age of information overload. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michel Martin and Nina Jankowicz.
Well, thank you for having us. Thank you for bringing more chairs. As ego-flattering as it was to have this be a standing room experience, we would like you to be comfortable. It's good to see you.
It's great to see you too, Michelle.
We have this very warm relationship and have never actually met because I've interviewed Nina a bunch of times, but never in person. So it's a delight to see you, and also ascertain that you are not an AI creation. You're not a deep fake. You are really.
That would be a really big scandal.
It would be very meta. It would be really meta. Can I just start by asking how you got interested in this question of disinformation? It goes back pretty deep into your kind of academic life. And then, of course, I want to ask whether your initial study was overseas. And did you ever envision that you would have to be thinking about this in the United States?
Oh, gosh, no. I didn't ever think that it would be something that is so acutely felt at every level of government as something that is affecting public safety, public health, and people's participation in democracy the way that it is today. Even in 2016, I never thought it would be quite so bad. But to rewind, I studied Russian in college and graduate school, and I came at this from the perspective of a Russianist. I studied in St. Petersburg, Russia, spent a lot of time, blood, sweat, and tears, learning Russian, and then went to graduate school for Russian and East European studies, and was always really interested in the questions about, how democracies evolve, how they're built, and found myself working at the National Democratic Institute, which is a nonprofit that focuses on democracy support all around the world. And I was working on those bastions of democracy, Russia and Belarus. And at that time, it was actually a really interesting moment in both of their histories. There was kind of a democratic resurgence in Belarus, a little bit of the same in Russia as well. It was when Alexei Navalny was running for mayor of Moscow. But my first kind of personal brush with disinformation was the fact that Russia described NDI, the National Democratic Institute, as kind of a CIA outpost, color revolutionists who were trying to undermine the Russian government and undermine Putin. Now, if I had been working for the CIA, I think I would have been making a lot more money than NDI paid me. But obviously we weren't doing that. And when I really started to get interested in this was when Russia started attacking us, and I'd talked to my, esteemed colleagues at NDI, many of whom had been in these jobs in one way or another since the Cold War, and didn't really get the internet. And I saw what Russia was saying about us on the internet, and I said, we got to be more proactive. We need to get our story out there, because there's nothing nefarious about what we're doing. If Putin's party, United Russia, wanted to show up to one of our political party trainings, we'd let them do it. If they want to be more responsive to their constituents, sure. Let's empower them to do that. And so there was a little bit of a push and pull there. And then the first invasion of Ukraine happened with Euromaidan in 2013 and the invasion in 2014, a full 10 years ago. And I really felt a pull to be in Ukraine, so I kind of serendipitously found my way there on a Fulbright fellowship. I applied at the very last moment and thought there's no way that this will happen, and eventually ended up there in 2016. What else happened in 2016, right? But it was really interesting to be in Kyiv, seeing how Ukraine was reacting to the election, not only the election of Donald Trump, but revelations about Russian election interference and disinformation, because essentially what not only the Ukrainians, but the Estonians, the Poles were saying was, well, we told you so. And the United States has approached Russia, but also the information environment, with an enormous amount of hubris. We were just like, our institutions are going to be okay, right? And so that's really where I kind of dug in and said, I think there's a lot to learn from these experiences here. And that's where my first book came about.
Can you just briefly tell us, what's the kind of origin of disinformation as a tool of warfare, essentially? Because I was thinking about this in preparation for our conversation. I've been covering politics in one form or another for a long time, and you were very nice not to say how long, because then I would have to be mad at you. But it's arithmetic, not calculus. And I just remember, I remember covering, like a lot of people covered local news. And, people were always doing crazy, ugly stuff, like posting leaflets, predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, basically saying the election day was the wrong day. Yeah. Or saying that, have you ever seen that? Yeah. Posters saying the election is November 6th. Or 3rd, which is, ugly. And of course, maybe people will remember the Whisper campaign directed at George Bush when he ran for president in 2000, mainly in South Carolina, for what we call sort of push polling, people pretending to poll, but spreading disinformation, spreading lies, saying that he had an illegitimate Black daughter, and if you knew that, would that change the way you thought about him? Do you all remember that? You all remember that? Okay, so yes, he has a daughter who is of color, who is adopted. He did not have an affair with anybody. You know what I mean? So those kinds of dirty tricks is something that has always been a part of politics. In fact, there's a story about the New York Times used to be, still is in some ways, the New York Times used to be an early adapter of new technologies. And there's a story about a Times reporter going to cover a Richard Nixon rally in West Virginia. And when Nixon realized that he was going to record what he actually said so he couldn't deny it later, he became outraged. Who the hell are you? Get out here. As a precursor to other who the hell are you, get out of here, political figures that we now know. So I guess what I'm saying is this has always happened, but there's something really new about both the magnitude, the way it's been used. So can you just briefly, how did this start? Has this always been a part of statecraft and it's just now permeated the rest of our lives, or how did it start?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned the New York Times, because there's a really famous incident of, I would call this more propaganda and kind of handling of a journalist. The New York Times journalist who covered the Soviet Union in the 30s very famously saw evidence of the man-made Ukrainian famine that the Soviet Union kind of created because it was taking all of Ukraine's grain and food that Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, was producing and sending it to the rest of the Soviet Union, and tens of thousands of people died. It might even be more than that. This is called the Holodomor. They denied it for so long. This reporter willfully, because he had it pretty good in the Soviet Union and was being handled by his Soviet handlers, reported that there was no man-made famine. He was given the Pulitzer Prize. So this sort of thing has been happening, not just in politics, but nation states have been doing it for a long time as well. There's also the very famous example with Russia of Russia claiming that the AIDS epidemic was something that the US military engineered. Sound familiar? The difference is that now the internet allows Russia, and frankly people who are in this for power and profit, a tool with which to target the most vulnerable people in our societies with exactly the narratives that they want to hear. I used to say, all you need is a social media account and a credit card. Now, unfortunately, the way algorithmic amplification works, you don't even necessarily need to buy an ad if you know how to push the right buttons on social media. I always like to say the most engaging content is the most enraging content, and Russia certainly knows that. We just heard a couple weeks ago that Russia spent at least $10 million funneling through a subsidiary of RT in the United States called Tenet Media that was set up for this express purpose, $10 million to conservative YouTube influencers who were making salacious videos in order to amplify discord in our society. So that's the difference now. It's not just the magnitude, it's the speed at which things travel and how directly targeted it is to people who, in some cases, I mean, you can do targeting on Facebook to people who have previously recovered from a drug addiction or recently went through a divorce, who are emotionally vulnerable. This is one thing I do with my graduate students. I actually take them through the process of buying a Facebook ad. And these are folks who are going into public service usually. All of them are shocked. You know, these are smart people, and they're shocked at the extent to which they themselves and their families can be targeted online. And our adversaries are absolutely using that. And again, just so everyone doesn't think I'm Russia, Russia, Russia all the time, so are people in our country in order to push divisive narratives and spread us further apart for their own personal gain.
And it's cheaper than a nuclear sub, isn't it?
Oh my God.
I mean, it's cheaper than a nuclear, so they spent $10 million. That seems like a lot. How much is a nuclear sub? So all those movies like The Hunt for Red October, when they have all this sophisticated spyware, when you think, oh, I could just set up a troll farm in a warehouse and get people to fight among themselves. Mm-hmm. How cool is that? I don't have to send any missiles. I'll let them fight among themselves. All right, now I'm going to put you all on the spot. Have any of you ever been taken in by one of those fake sites? You have? Oh, okay. Do you want to fess up? You want to confess? What was it about? Do you remember? On Discord? Uh-huh. But how did they get you? What was it about? Was it? Okay. Oh, thanks. Oh, that sounds interesting. So she was going to give you the mic, but do you want to just quickly repeat that story that you started? It started out small. I'm sorry not to put you on blast. We're not going to ask your name. If you come up to the mic, then we'll ask your name. But so it started on Discord, romance novels, because you're in a romance novel discussion group. Now you're out at Everybody Knows, which is perfectly fine. We all have our
Abrams
thing.
writes romance novels.
Exactly.
It's cool now.
It is cool now.
I feel so much better about this now.
And then they start asking you questions, and then what? What do they want?
Yeah, so it starts with like special niche groups. So I'm on a Discord for that. And it's like a general discussion forum. Like they have different things that you can talk about. So it doesn't have to be specifically about, I guess, like Julia Quinn novels and the latest Bridgerton, whatever. But like, it can be in a general discussion. Like, did you hear about this news article? And then they'll like talk a little bit more in depth about it and suss out what the opinion is. And then they'll say, oh, like this feels okay, and everyone's kind of buying into it. And then they'll start talking about like for example, recently with the whole RT thing and like tenant media, and like then they started talking about like Telegram and how Telegram has like different sites, and like does anyone have like a username on Telegram?
Oh, okay.
And I was like, oh, this is weird, I don't like this, I'm gonna log off.
That's good. Okay, that's good advice. Log off. Well, so thanks. But you can't just log off. Thank you for that. You can't just log off, right? Why is it so insidious and invasive?
Yeah, well, this reminds me, if you remember back in 2018 and 2019, there was such a backlash in particular against Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, because everyone loves to hate Zuck, right? And he was up on Capitol Hill giving non-answers, and everyone was like, what are you doing, dude? And there was this big movement to get off of Facebook, to boycott Facebook. And for me, as somebody who has lived and worked in places like Ukraine, it just kind of totally missed the point, because I'm sure the same is true for places you've reported from, Michelle. Facebook is the internet in many places. And, love it or hate it, we all turned to things like Facebook and other social media during the pandemic. It's now, I hate that people say that there's this, online, offline dichotomy. Online is our real life now. We use it to pay for things. How many people use their Apple Pay today? Yeah, getting more and more, right? More and more people use Apple Pay. You use your phone for directions. You use it to text people that you're on your way to meet, et cetera. It is part of our fabric of daily life, and we can be targeted at almost every intersection of our lives with technology.
Well, say more about how Facebook operates in some countries, because for some people, like I'll just say, look, anybody who follows me, I minimally engage with Facebook. I mainly have my staff. My staff basically manages the site for our purposes of amplifying the work, but I don't engage with people. I don't have my family members on it, partly because I have little kids, and they're not little anymore. Sorry, kids, they're not little anymore. They can vote now. Just to let you, this year they can vote now. But when they were little, I did not want them to be, I didn't want their images out there and things like that, in part because of the experiences that you had, and because I follow your work. But in some countries, that feels not optional. Say more about that, if you would.
So from my experience in Ukraine, especially when I first got there and then went back for a reporting trip in 2019 when Zelensky was getting elected, I remember I was developing like my list of contacts and reaching out to people, and I'd send a normal like text message that we all send to one another. Fewer people have iPhones, so things don't go through as an iMessage, which is free on any carrier, right? But I'd send a text message, I got their phone number, and then they'd reply to me on Facebook Messenger. And I was like, this is interesting. Why is this happening? It was because I found later that the telecom companies in Ukraine actually subsidize Ukrainians' use of social media. Facebook, Twitter, Spotify, a couple of other things, YouTube, are all free for them. And this is true in many developing countries. It's true in Brazil, where there's another really big disinformation problem. It's true in many places in Africa. And in fact, in Africa, Zuckerberg has created this thing called Facebook Zero, where phones that are handed out there to people to get them connected to the web, not only do they have Facebook for free, it's like Facebook is your browser for the web. So for many people, it is the portal to not only how they socialize, but how they do business. Facebook is used kind of like LinkedIn in Ukraine. People list all their jobs, and they post professional updates alongside their kid updates and their cat pics. And that means that it's an extremely rich data source for adversaries to use, but also for political targeting. And that was one thing I found in 2019, that everybody kind of expected, Russia's going to go big on disinformation in this Poroshenko-Zelensky election. Actually, there was a lot of domestic disinformation happening in those campaigns, and they were using the very same tools that our adversaries use. And I might add, so are both campaigns right now. We know a lot about what the Trump campaign is doing online. There's been a lot of reporting about that over the past 8 years, the different targeting they use and things like that. Interestingly, the Harris campaign has taken flack for for some practices where on Facebook, not to get too technical, but when they're placing an ad where they're directing people to a news article about the campaign, they're able to essentially rewrite the headline to make it shorter, and they're rewriting the headlines to be more positive to the campaign. Now, to be clear, both campaigns are doing this, and it's common practice in political ads and always has been, but the campaign is now taking flack for that too. So my point is that these are really powerful tools. Even if you're not in a country where Facebook is free to access on your data plan, it is still a huge part of our lives, and it's being used to target us not only for political reasons, but to get you to buy products. One story that I always tell, it's a kind of a sad one. We all hear about Instagram ads for shoes or watches or whatever. When I gave birth to my son, I was not in the postpartum recovery unit for more than 24 hours before I got my first ad about post-pregnancy weight loss. And luckily I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. I think I took a screenshot of it to preserve it. But, it had been tracking my cookies, knowing that I was searching what fruit is my baby today, and throughout the pregnancy, and then probably geolocated me to the hospital and said, she's probably given birth. Now we can push her the weight loss ads and make her feel really badly about herself. And the emotional thing comes back there, right? The most engaging content is the most enraging or most emotional content, and that's how they get you.
So a couple questions here. When did, as we've discussed, and if those of you who cover politics, if you follow local politics, if you're involved in local politics, then amplifying negative things about your opponent, that's a tale as old as time. But the use of these tools, not just to sort of take something with a grain of truth, but to say things that are actively false and to plant those things. When did that become a thing in this country?
Yeah. Well, in Bill Adair's new book, which you've got, he traces that there's been an epidemic of political lying that has really ramped up. And by the way, this is out this week. It's called Beyond the Big Lie. Bill tells a lot of my story. Yeah,
we'll talk about it in a minute.
But he's the founder of PolitiFact, so he has the data, the receipts on.
Are you all familiar with PolitiFact?
The fact-checking website.
It's a fact-checking website. You'll know that a lot of news organizations now will rely on it, and they'll say, if they want to do a story about something in the news or a campaign ad or a claim that is particularly newsworthy for whatever reason, just to pull something out of the air like they're eating cats and dogs, just to make, just to think of
For example,
they will fact check it and they will make that information available to whoever wants it, and members of the public can utilize, but a lot of news organizations interview them a lot to get their take on it, because they have people who have subject area expertise and who follow these things closely. Okay,
and they give the worst liars the pants on fire rating. But so Bill tracks it, and I mean, it really ramped up, I think, from 2000 on, but then we saw obviously a really 2000 on.
Oh, 2000
from the year
on.
2000,
okay.
I would say on, and then we saw a real precipitous increase. Or I guess you can't really have a precipitous increase, can you? It really spiked come 2016 or really 2014 when Donald Trump entered the race. And from what I have seen, and again, Bill has more of the numbers on it, in my opinion, Donald Trump made it permissible for you to just repeat egregiously false things, and there was no consequence. In fact, he was rewarded for it, right? And so even though we saw some people in the lead up to the 2016 election in Donald Trump's own party, up to including the current vice presidential candidate, who were criticizing Trump, now it's kind of part and parcel of politics. And that is something, unfortunately, that I've had my own experiences with, where I'll be across the table from somebody who in 2018, called me up to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee and now lies about me with abandon. And I know that they know it's not true, but it's politically convenient for them. And the only way that I know to hold them accountable is to vote.
Well, let's talk more about that. I mean, one of the stories that stood out to me was one that was in the Times, where they dug into this story from 2016, where this story that tens of thousands of fraudulent Clinton votes were found in an Ohio warehouse. This was an entirely made-up story. It was made up by a 23-year-old college student at Davidson. He invented a publication that didn't exist. He then invented a story that didn't exist and posted it in this publication that didn't exist. And then guess what happened is that some news organizations, those with a political and ideological agenda, picked it up and amplified it. None of it was true. And the Times tracked him down and said, "Why'd you do it?" And he said, "Why'd you do it?" And he said, so of course, this is Trump says, I'm afraid the election is going to be rigged. I have to be honest. He says he was hearing more and more about evidence of rigging, and one of the stories he cited was this one. And so the story, this student was asked. He said that it started as a part-time gig that paid him about $1,000 an hour in web advertising revenue, and then he thought it was fun, and then he was a Republican, so he thought it was okay to do. And when we said to him, "Well, why would you think that's okay to do?" He said, "Well, we wanted to win." So this is sort of the point here. Look, I know this is going to be hard for some people to hear, and I know that this is the kind of thing that causes feelings. But one of the points that Nina, that Bill Adair makes in this book, and I brought it because it's just out this week. It's called Beyond the Big Lie. It's by Bill Adair. As Nina said, it's about he's the founder of PolitiFact, and he says that number one, political lying is an epidemic, and number two, he says Republicans do it more. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that he denied for years that this was true. Because people would ask him, does one party or another do it more? And he would say, well, we don't keep score. And one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that he admits that he was lying. And so, needless to say, I asked him, why did you do that? And he said, because he didn't want his objectivity to be impugned. And he didn't want to make it harder for him and for other journalists like him who were engaging this work to assail their objectivity. So of course I asked him, okay, well, why now? He said, because it's gotten so out of hand that he feels that he needs to just say the truth. And so the question becomes, and we can all discuss this later in the question and answer session if you all are interested in talking about this, why would it be the case that, and we're all in the same business. I mean, I'm in public media, I'm in public media, and the government does not pay for NPR. It's National Public Radio. The government, just to clarify this for those who want to know the facts, if you do, that maybe 3% of NPR's funding comes from the government. What does that funding go to?
$1.37 per person per year.
Per year. What does that money go to? It goes to satellites. It goes to infrastructure in places that cannot afford it. In a big market station, you could raise, a couple $1 million at a fundraiser. But we have stations in Alaska where if you don't get up-to-date weather reports, you will die. We have places that are far from major infrastructure, so it goes to pay for hardware for places that can't pay it on their own for public service purposes, and some of these stations may use it to buy program. All I'm saying here is that it is difficult for us to say this because it is perceived as a partisan statement, but the facts are what they are, according to people who should know. And this is Bill's argument that he's been tracking this for 10 years now, and he says it's unfortunately become part of the culture of one of the political parties, one of the major political parties, and I said, well, why might that be? And you all might have theories about this. He said, because his theory is that for some people in this party, that there's a serious sense that they're facing an existential threat, that the vision of their country as they know it is under threat, and that therefore whatever they do to preserve that is justified. So then I would argue, if it's politically expedient, why don't Democrats do it more? And his argument is that for whatever reason, that there's less of a culture of that tolerates it. And also, there is not a media infrastructure that tolerates it. Because if people are going to engage in this conduct, we're going to call them on it.
I mean, look
just
at,
like you were saying about this headline.
Well, and Tim Waltz and his wife misspoke and called the fertility treatment that they underwent IVF, and the media had a 5-day hullabaloo about it. That's not. I mean, go spend that on something worthwhile than dragging this craziness through the mud. There's kind of a double standard, I would say, in that regard.
Well, that's an interesting question. See, that's an interesting question. Is it a double standard, or does one side care about that more than the other side?
Yeah.
I mean, which is the chicken and which is the egg? Is it
exactly
that, or is it that the legacy media, here we're talking about the legacy media, because as we know, there are different medias. I mean, we should know this by now, right? There are different medias that have different ethics, and different instincts and different priorities. There are things that people do at some other news organizations. I would not be working there, like making political contributions. I would not be working there. I would not be working at NPR. If it were determined that I'd made political contributions, I would not be working there. I'd be walked out of the building today. So, and other news organizations with different priorities, that is something that is a done thing, right? So, advising political candidates daily, advising, the president daily. You will note that at CNN, when Chris Cuomo was found to have been advising his brother, the governor, he was walked out of the building the next day. That is a standard thing at Fox. That's a standard thing. I'm sorry, So I guess what I'm saying is, so what's the chicken and what do you think? What's the chicken and what's the egg? Is it like the legacy media is afraid of being called biased, or is it that the people who consume legacy media care more about what's actually true?
Yeah, I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't think it's a question of bias. I don't think that there's bias against one side or the other. I think there's a bias for the truth, and that's a good thing, that we're accurate and that words have meaning, right? I think there have not been enough consequences for people who are making their lives out of lies. Dominion was a good start. The Giuliani case with Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss was a good start. This is the reason that after a lot of thinking, I decided that I was going to sue Fox News for defamation. Now, the short story, for those that don't know the background of this, is that I, for a short time, held an appointment in the Biden administration coordinating responses to disinformation at the Department of Homeland Security that was widely lied about and said that I was going to be a censor. A lot of other horrible things were said about me. Tucker Carlson said that I was a highly self-confident young woman, which I believe he meant as an insult. But he said a lot of other horrible things about me. I was on Fox News every hour on the hour for weeks on end while I was pregnant. Like, I was weeks away from giving birth.
That you were going to be a ministry of truth.
Yes. They said that I was going to be chief censor of the United States and that I would, this is another Tuckerism, I had the power to send men with guns to the homes of Americans with whom I disagreed. There is a not insignificant part of the population, and the reason there are 2 police officers here today, thank you very much, sirs, that believes I've committed treason, and I've had death threats against me and my family. In fact, I just got another one yesterday. It's very serious, right? And lies have consequences, particularly for individuals' lives. And I think we, as a country, need a way to reckon with that. And it's not just at the ballot box. We also need to reckon with it in the legal system, because the other side is certainly, the other side who is not, they're anti-truth, I suppose, they are certainly finding their ways to dismantle independent research into disinformation, efforts like this one I was supposed to head in the Biden administration, and I think we got to fight back, and that's part of what I have been trying to do over the past couple months.
We're going to go to questions in a minute, questions and conversation in a minute, and folks who want to participate. How do you want to do this? Do you want to put the mic here? I don't want to make it a fitness contest, so I mean, if that's okay, because otherwise you can run around with the. So if we could put that here, we'll just start in a couple of minutes if you don't mind. And if you are unable or unwilling to come to the mic, then we can come to you. So we're going to start that in a minute. But and then I'm going to save 5 minutes at the end for Nina to give us a closing thought. But just why does this matter? I really think it's worth hearing. Like, why does it matter? Because there are some people who think, well, both sides lie. What's the big deal? Everybody exaggerates. Everybody says things like, you look great in that, when, they don't. And, so why? No, you do look fabulous.
Oh, thank you. You too.
And that is not a lie. But I'm just saying, some people think, well, that's just the way people are. So why does this matter? Why are we making a big deal out of this?
So I think the most elegant example happened just in the last couple of weeks with the hurricane misinformation. And I use the term misinformation because I do think a lot of people who were engaging with that weren't doing so deliberately. They're scared. They don't trust the government because the government hasn't necessarily showed up for them before. And so they're amplifying things that might not be true. But there is disinformation upstream of that, right? That is deliberate, and people are doing it because they want to score political points. Or in some cases, they're defrauding people out of their government benefits. And this is one that is, I think, especially poignant, not just because of the timing, but because the agency that I was going to head was going to be bringing together parts of DHS, including FEMA, to surface best practices and lessons learned for all this stuff. And wouldn't it have been nice if over the last couple weeks there had been one single point of contact for reporters, for concerned citizens, for folks to turn to so that we could say, no, you're going to get more than $750 in benefits. And just to be clear, FEMA and the White House and governors, even Republican governors who have stood up for the truth, thank you, governors, over the past couple of weeks have done a great job. But this ends up affecting public safety in these cases. People don't have clear information about where to go and how to get help. It affects public health, as we've seen during the pandemic. It affects people getting the monetary help they need. And then if we're going to get we are here at Eagleton, it affects people's participation in democracy. And there is nothing more sacred in this country than us going out and exercising our right to vote. And we can't do that. We can't have that fulsome conversation unless we're using the same shared set of facts. Then things really just break down. So for me, that's what it's about. And I think, I was at an event last week where somebody asked a lieutenant general in the Army, are we going to need some sort of precipitating event like 9/11 was for the security communities where we really get our butts in gear? And I was like, was the pandemic not it? Was January 6th not it? Were these hurricanes not it? How many more huge, devastating, informational events is it going to take for us to wake up to this threat? I don't know.
Well, I have two questions about that. And please do, if you're ready to move to questions, if you wouldn't mind coming to the mic in the center of the floor here. Why is the U.S. so slow to act on this as a country and to recognize it as a national security threat? Because it is. I cannot tell you how many people I interviewed during the COVID pandemic who said, I didn't believe it, and then I had a picnic or I had a family reunion and 10 of my family members got sick and X number of them died. I cannot tell you how many people I interviewed who had this experience.
Yeah.
And how, as we are seeing now, people who are in hurricane-affected areas, FEMA workers have had to move into secure locations rather than going door to door as they would prefer to do because they have been threatened. And this is not made up because people have been arrested for threatening them. So I guess what I'm saying is, why is the U.S. so slow to address this? Is there something about our information culture that says that we're not supposed to talk about this, or people will just sort it out for themselves?
Yeah, it's
especially in contrast to Europe, which has taken some aggressive steps. Western Europe has taken some aggressive steps to
some
allow
of them too
people.
aggressive for our taste, right? With the First Amendment,
What is your thinking about why?
Yeah, I think certainly we are really circumspect and slow and very deliberate when it comes to anything that could encroach on freedom of speech, as we should be, right? As we should be. But I think for a long time, we conceived of disinformation as something that we could only fight by removing speech. And ironically, that's never been something that I have been in favor of. I refer to that as playing whack-a-troll. It doesn't work. And what we need to do instead is empower people. We need to get more good information out. We need to make sure that we're enabling communicators in government and other institutions to get that information out. And instead, there's just been this focus on, again, things that would encroach on these freedoms that we hold so dear. And the whole conversation has been totally muddled now. And in some cases, very purposely, as I said before. I was kind of the vanguard of attacks on the disinformation research community. I'm not the only one who's dealt with this sort of stuff, and entire research institutions have been shut down. The social media platforms have cut off data access. There is very little collaboration between federal government and industry, so the tech industry and social media platforms now. We have our blinders on, and it's been so politicized now that I don't think there is hope of getting some federal regulations on transparency and oversight passed. And we have, again, a political party and a presidential candidate who's actively trafficking in this stuff because it benefits him. So I think we missed our window. We missed our window to get stuff done, and it's going to be a real slog to get out of the deep hole that we've dug for ourselves now. I'm sorry I can't be more optimistic about that.
Okay, well, I'm not going to let you leave us devastated. Before we leave here, you're going to tell us something that we can do as citizens. Go ahead, let's get started.
I'm Shauna Shamus. I'm a professor on the Camden campus, and I'm thrilled to hear this is a wonderful conversation. Thank you. The right to vote is, of course, central, and any political science professor would be happy to hear you say that the you said the only way I know to hold them accountable is to vote. And I wrote it down because it struck me that there are some assumptions embedded that I just wanted to ask about further, right? Because I'm worried that that might not be true. Right, not to be a downer yet again.
What isn't true?
So the assumption that if enough of us vote, right, that people actually don't want this world, and that in fact would vote against this world, and that they don't want a world that is in fact more like Putin's Russia, where what you want or what you have is a kind of a world governed by chaos, and therefore you need a strongman political leader.
Interesting question.
Right. We call it authoritarian kind of mindedness in political science, and I do think it's on the rise. So I'm not sure that voting itself is enough. I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to politicians themselves, right, I've had, again, unfortunate experiences with folks, sitting members of Congress who I learned because of parliamentary privilege that they have, I can't do anything about the lies that they tell about me on the floor of Congress. And again, so the only thing that I can do is either again, fight with them in the public square, which I have done, and they have just doubled down, or encourage people who believe in the truth to send a signal, whether that will change behavior or not. I think these lawsuits help. But again, they don't hold the folks that are in the seats of power accountable in that way. And I'd be interested in Michel's thoughts about the way that the media infrastructure can send a signal or hold the powerful to account. And I mean, you do, but then we see folks who are extremely unctuous who find ways to slither out of these questions, right?
Well, I tell you once, I want to hear what you all have to say, but I tell you one of the things that I think is an impediment in legacy media is that our attitude is, we told you that already. We told you that already. Our attitude is, I told you that yesterday. It's no longer news today, and therefore, repetition is how we learn. Repetition is how we learn, right? So you're in school, you take a summer break, you come back from break, what do? You do drills, you do a review, you do a refresher. We are very, for whatever reason, loath to repeat ourselves. Like, I told you that already. So I think some of it's a structural imbalance. Also, I'm just gonna say it, there is not an information ecosystem on the left that's equivalent to that on the right.
Yeah.
People want to make Fox and MSNBC equivalent. They may be in the national news in the sense that, but there is no local news infrastructure that is oriented toward, progressivism the way there is a local news infrastructure on the right. And the reality of it is that people tend to believe their local news more than they believe national news for whatever reason. And so I feel like there's a lot of structural issues involved with the way the news media operates in America that is not the cause of this, but definitely makes it worse.
Yeah.
It's like you're sick, and then you're doing something that makes you sicker, even though that's not why you're sick.
Yeah, well, and
I hate to use that
thing-
term because somebody else has appropriated that term, which is an appropriate term, but unfortunately now I don't want to use it because it's being applied to all things that it isn't relevant to. Anyway.
One thing also that just sparked for me, I mean, Bill talks a lot about, unsurprisingly, fact-checking in his book, which is not necessarily always the most useful thing. And he and I have had long conversations about this because fact-checking can actually cement the false information in somebody's brain. Psychological studies since the 70s have shown that. The other thing is that when politicians are getting fact-checked kind of face-to-face, it ends up being this very combative exercise, and I don't think voters actually learn a whole lot from it. So Bill is of course, very in on fact-checking, but kind of wants to do it in new and innovative ways with AI and things like that, and I'd like to see how, that evolves.
But to your question, I think I have this question myself, is has our adherence to certain points of view become a part of our identities now? Is it no longer that this is either true or not true, or is it that if I believe this, that means that I am that, as opposed to, it's almost like a religious belief. It's almost like the dogma that we go to church and we repeat our statement of belief. And is it almost like a statement of belief? If I am this, then I believe that. And this is what concerns me, because facts should not be about whether you believe something shouldn't. Now we're really getting into the realm of deep faith.
Yeah.
And as a faith-committed person, I'll just tell you, as a faith-committed person, which I am, I I think we should be able to have discernment about what is appropriate to what sphere. So anyway, here we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Zania Morin. I am an associate teaching professor here in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, and I'd like to bring science into this conversation. When I look back at my teaching, I had police officers when we talked about genetically modified food. When we've had climate scientists here who have been dragged before Congress, the merchants of doubt, this idea of marketing. And my question to you is this really about what is true rather than sowing doubt so that we no longer know what is true? And how can science and how can universities and university scientists help to kind of break that bubble?
That's a great question, and we in the kind of counter disinfo community talk a lot about what we can learn from the climate science movement and the way that although things are, of course, still quite imperiled, the way that climate scientists have prevailed. There was also a defamation suit that climate scientist won recently. Not the biggest settlement, but he fought through for a decade and won $1 million after from people who defamed him. I think in terms of what science can do better, I think we learned from the pandemic that scientists are not always the best communicators, and we need to learn how to communicate these extremely complex things in accessible ways that give people the same balm that a conspiracy theory might give them. That's why they turn to conspiracy theories, right? And it might not be the simple explanation that they need, but we need to meet them where they are, and that's why I think we saw this rise of medical professionals on TikTok during the pandemic. People who were saying, all right, here's what this crazy graph shows you. Here's what you need to know about it, and here's the advice that we can give you. I also think communicating doubt is important, and kind of embracing that, saying we're not always gonna have a perfect answer for you. I think that was a huge misstep from the government during the pandemic, just giving certain advice that was kind of a moving target from week to week. Your point about doubt is that the goal. Peter Pomerantsev wrote a great book called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which talks about the Russian government's strategy of just flooding the zone, which entities here, including Steve Bannon and his acolytes, have taken on since then. So that, it's really hard and a lot of work to learn what the truth is. And so I think we'll talk about a couple information literacy strategies in a little bit, but we all have a role to play there. And I think when it comes to not just scientists, but academics writ large, trying as much as you can. I know you got to get those peer-reviewed articles out, but trying to do things to communicate where your audiences are and do it in a way that they can understand easily. That you think about your Aunt Sally or your Uncle Bob who might traffic in conspiracy theories at your Thanksgiving dinner table, and you explain it in a way that they would understand and identify with.
Could you just say more, though, why it is that fact-checking sometimes reinforces false views? Say more about that.
Yeah, because you end up hearing...
Not false views. People are entitled to their opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. False information.
So, the idea there is you hear the false information more than you hear the true information. So you've already been primed to hear the falsehood. And then somebody says, to use the Bush example, hey, have you heard that George Bush has an illegitimate daughter? Well, that's not true. You tend to, since the other thing has been repeated twice already and you've been primed for it, your brain just kind of flattens it and says, it leaves off the not true part and remembers the other thing. So what the best practice is, if you're fact checking, you do the truth sandwich. You say, George Bush does not have an illegitimate daughter. Some people are saying that, but it's not true. Still, fact checking can sometimes reiterate those views for people.
Whew. We need more beverages after this one. Adult ones. Okay. Yes.
Hello. I'm not sure if...
Yeah. Or put it down a little bit, like that. Yeah, see, like this.
Right. I have a bit of a quiet voice, but I think everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. This has been such a really interesting conversation so far. My name's Ashiana. I'm a student here, and I study computer science and political science, so this is kind of like right where my interests are. And something that I've thought a lot about in terms of political communication, and also what I would sort of refer to as what our public square is now, is really like social media, specifically Facebook, Instagram, those kind of avenues, Twitter. And you were talking a little bit earlier about how there isn't as much of a relationship between the private sector versus the government and how that relationship works. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more on that, and kind of a follow-up to that as well is on the word bias. I think that my thoughts on this are that bias is something that everyone has, and it's not really something that we can eliminate, but more so that something that we should be explicit about. So if a journalist is reporting on something being like, hey, like this issue personally affects me in this particular way, so maybe I'm biased in this way. And I would just like to get your thoughts on what you think bias has, like what kind of relationship you think we should have with bias, and also the...
But can I just understand more about what you want to know about the relationship between the government and the private sector? Like what, I'm not really sure I understand the question. Are you arguing, or are you wondering whether, because there is so little regulation of this in the United States, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah,
or?
so just with like, for example, what kind of responsibility does Facebook have in an election cycle to be monitoring as a private company that is not particularly supposed to have a political view that they're supporting, but also it is a private company, so if it wanted to, it could.
And
just
it
like
does.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm just going to try to distill 8 years of history into like 30 seconds. In 2016, Facebook and other social media did a very bad job detecting and reacting to foreign influence campaigns online. People were understandably very upset about this because Russians were literally buying ads in rubles about the US election in 2016. And Facebook was like, yeah, looks good. We'll take your money. Thank you. And as a result, there was, I would say, a little bit of an overcorrection. The social media companies did a lot more content moderation, which to be clear, they all have terms of service that they need to uphold. They started to do more of again, responding not only to foreign interference campaigns, but things like hate speech and terrorist content, et cetera, et cetera. When they were doing takedowns related to foreign interference, there used to be coordination with law enforcement, like the FBI or other parts of the intelligence community. If you remember last election cycle in 2020, Iran posed as the Proud Boys and tried to dissuade Democratic voters from going to vote in swing states. There was a big coordinated campaign between law enforcement, and then also I suppose they handed off accounts and signatures and things like that so that the social media platforms could, in a coordinated way, take that content down. And that had been true for a long time. Because of the politicization of this arena, and actually a case that made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, that was actually put on pause for a long time, that sort of cooperation that I think we all want for our national security and our democracy, and hasn't quite gotten back to the level that it really should be at. Now, that's on the foreign policy side. When it comes to content moderation more broadly, I think we're seeing with the Musk-era Twitter/X, and if you've ever looked at things like either Truth Social or the former Parler, alternative social media platforms where there is no content moderation, we all sign up when we go on these platforms and share our, dog pictures or whatever. We sign up to rules that they have. Just like when you go into a grocery store, no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? You're not allowed to traffic in body parts. You're not allowed to share terrorist content. You're not allowed to share, depending on the platform, pornographic content. And the platforms have a duty of care to their users, you, the customers, to enforce those policies. They don't always do that. That's the problem. And we don't have anything saying that they need to do that. And as a result, it does mean that depending on the platform, they are making judgments about political content on the platform, and there is no oversight in what's happening. And so this whole argument about, well, is the government influencing the social media platforms too much as they make these judgments? I think that's a great question. I think rather than having an inquisition about it, which is what we've been having, we should probably make a law that establishes some oversight and transparency of how the social media platforms are making those decisions. That was longer than I intended it to be. The question, I think, about bias is a great one for you to answer as a journalist.
I guess I understand the impulse of that, and I understand the logic of it, but I guess, look, you can look at my face, right? And you can see, as a woman of color, I feel like I'm constantly having people impute beliefs and motives to me that I may or may not have. So I feel that a lot of us have already been dragged into that space, whereas other people are privileged to have identities that are not constantly under question. So I guess my attitude about it is, I'll do it when you do it. Like, I'll do it when everybody has to do it.
Well, and also,
I mean,
I think outlets like the 19th and other kind of feminist-focused media outlets in particular, they've got women by and large staffing them, right? And I think that means that they cover certain things very differently than male colleagues would. Since I'm a woman, does that mean I can't do research on gendered disinformation on online abuse, right?
But that's my point.
Exactly.
My point is I resist this notion that demography is destiny.
Yeah.
I resist this notion that because I am X, I must think Y. And I just feel if we take down that road, then what space do we have for critical thinking? Because the implication is, I know this is not what you're saying, the implication is we only think what we already are. And who is the determinant of what that is? And that is why I resist this notion unless it becomes truly individualistic and we all say, look, I am a married, heterosexual, Christian mother and stepmother, and my dad was a firefighter, and you see my point? Right. So that's where I resist this notion that there is no such thing as independent thought that is apart from one's identity, that is external and internal. Does that make sense? You understand what I'm saying? So, Nancy, can we go a couple more minutes just so we can take these questions? Okay, we can take, okay, great. So, I know that everybody's got stuff to do. It is the playoffs, it is Major League playoffs. I totally get that.
I know,
so
my mom wants to watch the Mets game.
People who are already in line, if we could just have your question, and we will, do you mind if I just ask all of you to ask what your question is, and we'll try to answer them, and then we'll give Nina a closing thought. And then we'll hopefully all think about more about what we can do this Thanksgiving when Uncle Bud, whom we love dearly, says saying stuff that isn't true. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay,
of
cool.
course.
Hi, my name is Kieran. I'm a post-undergrad at Rutgers majoring in economics and political science. I'm also the opinions editor of the Daily Targum, the school newspaper. So my question involves around sort of the philosophy of media in general. So some people think that the goal of media should be to just report the facts and just let people make their own decisions about it. Others want the news to be a more active involvement in shifting public opinion, especially as other organizations have taken that approach. Which approach do you think is more likely to take hold in the journalistic world, and what should the goal of journalism be?
You're looking at me for that one? I think there's room for infotainment, right? Like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert. I think that is a service to package the news in a way that is more engaging for people sometimes. But I do think there are times when those guys have gotten pants on fires from PolitiFact too. And as somebody who is frequently interviewed by wonderful journalists like Michel and folks in the cable news spectrum as well, I can tell you from my perspective as an expert, when I go and I do a cable news hit that's 2 or 2.5 minutes long, I can very infrequently get into the level of detail and nuance that I think people need to learn about and hear for the topic that I cover. I much prefer to talk to NPR and PBS, where if it's a 5-minute interview, they apologize to you. And I think we owe it to people not to dumb things down for them. And that doesn't mean there's no room for opinion coverage or coverage that makes an argument, right? And again, to bring up the 19th News, which is where I met Kira, who's in your row, and why I'm here tonight. I think they do a great job of bringing coverage to people that is for a specific audience, informed by a specific experience that is changing policy and opinions, but is doing so based in fact and based in good journalistic practice. How'd I do, Michelle?
Great. Come on. I'm good. You know how to do it.
Hello. All right. So I just want to thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it. My name is John. Hello, everybody. I am a graduate student here in political science, and I also teach high school economics. And unlike the classroom, I can express my particular opinions here, so I will be biased in my question. So my question for you is, it's my interpretation that we are in an era of increasing income inequality, and not just that it is a particular era, as some authors suggest, but that this increasing income inequality is inherent in the long-run dynamics of the capitalist mode of production. Now, that being said, I would also like to argue that the major legacy media, as well as the social media companies, are highly concentrated private powers with highly concentrated political power that goes along with that. And I think that this concentrated power incentivizes them for political and economic gain to produce disinformation and not really counteract it. So my question for you guys is, do you recognize this problem? And if it is a problem, can we solve it without transgressing the private property system, or may we have to go beyond that? Thank you.
Well, this public media is owned by you, so you're welcome. So thank you. I mean, you know, as I said, we get 3% of our funds from the government, and it goes to infrastructure in places that can't afford it, satellite dishes and other infrastructure by and large. So you own us. Yeah. And so I appreciate you. In fact, I should have started by saying I appreciate you, because this is what we exist for. Now, look, is it perfect? Of course not. No, nothing of humans is perfect, because humans are imperfect. But what I am saying is that public media is owned by you. Our incentive structure is to satisfy you. And so there is no one person who can shut us down, assuming that the laws of the country remain as we understand them to be, right? There's no one person who can, you know, no car dealer, no, you know, tech mogul who can decide that they're mad at us and we have to go home. We go home because you no longer support us. So there is an alternative. And we need to do better at engaging you. I think different things engage different people. You don't talk to you don't talk to your high school kids the same way that you talk to your peers in graduate school, do you? You try not to, right? Because you talk to people where they are, right? So that's what we're trying to do. What I would argue is we need to get better at talking to people where they are. The question is, to your initial question is, where are they? Do people just want to be reinforced in what they already believe? Or do they want to know things that they don't already know? I think our thing is we have to continue to validate and uplift knowing what you don't already know. This is the thing that keeps me up at night, if you want to know. Sorry.
And on the social media side of the equation, just very, very quickly, there was a big movement, and for some folks on Capitol Hill, there still is, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar in particular, to break up the social media platforms, in particular Facebook. Facebook owns, you know, however many of them. I think there's a thought now that it will be detrimental to the fight against disinformation if they do that, because at this point, at least there is information sharing across the structures from Instagram to Facebook to WhatsApp to whatever, and that's helpful. And if they're different entities, like we don't see a lot of that information sharing from TikTok to Facebook, let's say, and so folks are worried about that. However, I challenge the computer programmer in the audience who's now gone to create a public social media network. This exists in Vermont. I was just there last week. They have something called Front Porch Forum, which is a locally based social media platform that people love to use because it connects them with their neighbors. They use it 5 minutes a day. There's no ads. It tells them about local goings-on. It's very Vermont. But like, could we have something like that? It's like the nice version of Nextdoor. Could we have something like that? That is public media. Ann Applebaum and Peter Pomerantsev have talked about this for a while. It does seem like pie in the sky, but maybe we could do it.
Mm-hmm. Hi, good evening. My name is Eric. I am an Eagleton alumni. My question is, this election year, we have seen a lot of misinformation around immigration. I work in immigration policy and has made my job very hard in really educating folks, elected officials about, you know, the issue. And so, you know, I feel like the right has been very effective with their messaging and has really even pushed like progressives and Democrats to begin to pursue restrictive like border policies and tough on immigration stances. And that has a real life effect on community members, and comments from President Trump about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, that's very hurtful. And there's a lot of misinformation in the public. I mean, that's out in the public. And so my question is, how do we combat misinformation as citizens? What is the media's role in this? Just because, like you mentioned earlier, panic sells, and, all these stories sells. And so, I feel like a lot of news outlets, aside from Fox and other outlets, also do have a responsibility to be better stewards of that information.
I'm going to ask Nina to hold that thought, because that's what's going to be her closing thought. So we are going to answer that, but that's going to be her closing thought. Sir.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Paul Danelchik, president of the NJ Conservative GOP. I'm kind of interested how I got invited here, but I'm so happy
We're happy
I
to
was.
see you.
Yeah, same here. I want to discuss two things. One, an example of a double standard, and then second, misinformation. Senator Schumer, at a women's rights rally, threatened Kavanaugh, actually threatened him. You better do the right thing or you're done, Kavanaugh. And the rhetoric was so hot that some crazed person went to Kavanaugh's house with an AK-47. Nothing was done. Nothing was done to Senator Schumer. But if Ted Cruz ever said something like that, threatening one of the liberal justices, what do you think would have happened?
When did he say that? Where exactly did he say that, and when did he exactly say that? And is that, in fact, what he actually said?
Yes.
Okay, well, tell me when.
It even came up in his last debate, which if you want to know
You mean
how to...
Schumer's debate?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
It was excellent.
But I know what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about with people at the Kavanaugh incident, because I live somewhat near there, so I know exactly what you're saying. All those justices have had security now. They've already had security. But your point is, you feel that there is a
There wasn't really nothing done to Schumer about that. That was an ugly threat. And during his debate for re-election, when his opponent brought it up to him, he sounded like Ralph Cramden up there. He didn't know what to say. So I think that's an absolute double standard. Now, misinformation. During the last election, they kept showing immigrants in cages wrapped in tin foil. That came from the Obama administration, and they pasted it on Donald Trump. So this misinformation goes both ways. I can direct these people here to certain conservative media research people, accuracy in media, and we'll find just as much on the left as the right. So the right doesn't have an ownership on that, and I condemn any kind of campaign that uses misinformation. So I wanted that to be made clear. Thank you.
So I want to respond to that, because I think when it comes to members of Congress that have been making threats, maybe Senator Schumer didn't get held to account for that. There are certainly plenty of people on the Republican side who have threatened me personally, who have lied about me, and who I have attempted to hold to account in a very respectful way by sending them letters and talking to them face to face like you and I are now. And they have not apologized to me for that. And nor have they been held to account for the lies that they've told. I'll also just remind everybody that a member of the House called Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the B word, and the House voted not to censure him for that. So that is the level of rhetoric in Congress right now. I think everybody needs to tone it down, because you should not be threatened violently for doing your job. And I believe that no matter what side of the spectrum you're on, even if I vehemently disagree with you. In fact, there are people who have been threatened that have come after me, and I have stood up for them in the public sphere, because I think that what is happening to our politics today, where again, somebody like me who is appointed to a position and then is widely lied about and has to deal with threats every day for the rest of her life, that should not be the norm in our politics. And it is. It's the norm for those justices. It's a norm for many civil servants, and it's a sad place that we're in. To try to bring it home on a more optimistic note, unless you have one more thing.
My only point here is that Bill Adair, who has done this work, is not saying that Republicans have a monopoly on mistruth, but what he is saying is that it is more predominant in the Republican Party because it's more tolerated. Now, it is a fact that Republican members of Congress, like Steve Scalise, have been shot by people who, I mean, the former President Trump has been, threatened and successfully attacked this year. That's a fact. So it's not like Republicans aren't paying the price for this. But the question I would have for you is, who is asking people to go out and beat people up at his rallies? This has been a part of the former president's political conduct since he came into office. Who is asking people to go out and attack the Capitol and disrupt the vote count? So I think what I would argue is that we all, just like we're most effective with our friends, we're most effective as change agents with the people who already believe in us and care about us. To Nina's point, both parties need to police their actions. Both parties need to tone it down. But I don't think that of the two major candidates running today, one of them is not encouraging other people to attack people at their own rallies, which is something that happened yesterday. And with one of the candidates, it's not happening with the other. And that is the difficult part for somebody like me, somebody like Nina, who would like to claim that middle space. But if we don't tell the truth, then we're lying. That's the point that I think we have to make today. So Nina, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for staying. But Nina, could you just give us a closing thought? Tell us what you'd like to think about as we leave here. What should we be thinking about? What can we do as citizens?
We all have a role to play here, no matter your political inclination, no matter who you're going to vote for in less than 3 weeks. When you are engaging online, I challenge you over the next couple of weeks, and frankly in the transition period as well, because I don't think that's going to be pretty, to remember, the most engaging in content online is the most enraging content. If you feel yourself getting emotional, take a breather from your social media. Put your phone down, go for a little walk, and if you find yourself still thinking about the thing that got you so worked up in a couple of minutes, then you can come back and do some lateral reading and say, who's reporting on this? Are they doing it in a similarly salacious way, right? Is anyone else reporting on this? Has this photo been misattributed? This is stuff you can do within 5 minutes. I'm not asking you to write a research paper, but just be a little bit more deliberate in how you consume and share information, because the virality, that happens with us, right? That's all something that's on us. And with those folks at our Thanksgiving dinner table, Uncle Bud and Aunt Sally, rather than trying to fact check them, engage in a conversation. Say, I hear you talking about child trafficking, which a lot of people who believe in QAnon, that's their motivating issue. Why are you so interested in that, Uncle Bud? And then you get into a conversation about what that animating issue is for them, and you can gently nudge them to something that's more authoritative. I've done this with people who have threatened me online, often men who have grandchildren in their pictures. They'll message me horrible things on Facebook, which I think is interesting. And I say, hey, Bob, nice to meet you. Your grandkid's the same age as my son. I see you served in Vietnam, so did my dad. I see you like football. My brother's a high school football coach. Invariably, these people have very poor cybersecurity. I can find all this stuff about them from their Facebook profiles. And I don't have the time to do this for every of the tens of thousands of people who have sent me horrible messages, but when I do engage in that civil way again, they tend to walk it back, and a couple of them have actually, said that they're sorry, and I think that's the energy that we need more of. And I know that sounds kind of trite and pie in the sky and kumbaya, but that's what democracy is supposed to be about. That's what I'll leave you with.
I think what I'll leave you with is I've actually interviewed a number of people who have been members of extremist groups. And the one thing that makes a difference is that somebody loved them and loved them enough to care that what they were hearing was true. And I know we all can't go out and hug an extremist, and that would be dangerous for some of us, and it's just not something that other people can do. But I'm telling you, I have interviewed people for years now who have been captured by extremist groups, people who have been this is true, people who have been neo-Nazis, people who have been white supremacists, people who have threatened to shoot up schools. The one thing that made a difference is that somebody cared enough about them to tell them the truth. So if I leave you with that, I know it's difficult. We want to thank you all for being here to visit with us and to visit with each other. But what we're saying is, I think what Nina and I are both saying is this is all of our problem. So we all have to be part of dealing with it and fixing it. So thank you for that.